Subscribe to our YouTube channel for in-depth interviews of India Inc. and press the bell icon so that you do not miss our updates.
Hello and welcome to Nirmal, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hiral, Dadia. Very good morning to all the viewers. We have with us Mr. Alejandro Barbajosa, VP Crude and LPG, Middle East and Asia Pacific Argus Media joining in. Welcome to the show, Alejandro. My first
Thank
question
you.
coming to you is the kind of moves that we've seen with crude prices from January to now. Good amount of volatility. There was a blip in the month of March as well, where we did go to negative. How do you assess the full situation in the last 4 to 5 months with crude?
I must say that OPEC has done a remarkable job in trying to rebalance the market. And that provided a lot of support for prices, especially as they came back from the lows. WTI went into negative territory, but let's think about Brent, a price of about $15, $16 per barrel. And thanks to OPEC's effort, we've seen the price return close to $50 per barrel earlier this year. I think the speed at which prices recovered, based on the expectation that OPEC was going to take out of the market a significant volumes of close to 10 million barrels per day, reassured the market that the overhang, the oversupply would be absorbed relatively quickly, and the inventories that had developed, especially in the second quarter at the peak of the lockdowns, would be reabsorbed. The problem is that after the summer, now we come to a situation where many countries are going back into that lockdown mode. And even if they are not, sectors in consumption, such as the aviation fuel, jet fuel, is taking much longer than expected to recover because, as you know, the air fleets, about 70 or 80% of the global air fleet remains grounded. So that's why we see weakness now. And, OPEC is also increasing production now because they expected that by now they would have already gone beyond the period of the biggest oversupply. That's where we find ourselves now, and that's why we have a bit of a weaker outlook for prices for the rest of the year.
Right. So from here on, what are the kind of levels, according to you, that we should be tracking right now with regards to crude prices? Because that band of say $40 to $50 per barrel is a constant that we are seeing right now. Where are we headed according to you?
Our Argus Consulting has the forecast that prices in the fourth quarter will average about $42 per barrel. And in the first quarter of next year, they should average about $45 per barrel for Brent. So we're talking about relative stability in prices for the coming months, and then a slight recovery, because even if we see a slowdown in the pace of inventory absorption, it's still expected that OPEC will do what it takes to take that surplus out of the market.
Right. And from here on, what's your anticipation with regards to the OPEC? Plus, what is the action that you think they would be taking from here on?
So their next formal meeting is in December, and it's unlikely that they will make any big announcements until then for the next 2 months. But I think that based on the renewed concern about the weakness of demand, we might try to see the leaders in the group, basically Saudi Arabia and Russia on the non-OPEC side, trying to come to an agreement to extend the deeper cuts that were only supposed to last until the end of this year. And remember that this is an agreement that goes over the expanse of the next 2 years until 2022. So it's very likely that they will have to keep adjusting the level at which they produce until then, based on the reality that prevails at the time. And if by the end of this year, we still find ourselves in a situation where there are the lockdowns and where demand continues to be depressed, they will have to adjust that and extend the cuts, the deeper cuts that were supposed to end at the end of this year.
Right. So clearly, in the month of July itself, they agreed to cut output by almost around 7.7 million barrels from August, taking it through to December. And this was mainly to prop up oil prices by limiting supply. Now, Iraq and others also pledged to pump below their quotas in September to offset overproduction earlier this year. What's the sense that you pick up? Do you think if they curb production from here on, post December as well, will it remain at 7.7 million barrels? Or do you think they will probably reduce it to say 5 to say even a 4 million barrels per day? What's the sense? What's the number that you're working with?
At present, Saudi Arabia is really intent that the oversupply and production, the busting of quotas that is coming from countries like Iraq, is controlled for the rest of this year. Unfortunately, though, we continue to see that Iraqi exports are growing or at least staying the same, and we don't see the big cuts that we would have to see from Iraq for that equation to rebalance. On the other hand, we see the UAE taking a leading role in ensuring that they comply with those quotas and that they compensate for the overproduction they had over the summer, right now and over the next 3 months. So it's a difficult balancing act when you are talking about countries like Iraq, which have been fighting wars internally for so many years, when there is desperate need for resources, not only to satisfy the usual budget requirements of these countries, but also to deal with a depressed economy because of the pandemic, right? I was looking earlier today that Iraq is already among the top 20 countries in terms of number of cases, together with Iran. Saudi Arabia as well is there. So you see lots of OPEC countries also suffering the pandemic. It's not only on the consuming side like India or Indonesia, it's also on the producing side that you see the need for these revenue coming from the oil or from the oil market. So it's difficult to see how a country like Iraq will actually manage to comply with its pledge to, rebalance the overproduction that they've had so far.
Right. And with this, again, demand is a major concern. Interestingly, you had BP as well from UK, who came out and said that probably the demand for oil could have peaked in the year 2019. And they actually came out and laid 3 scenarios for energy demand over the next 30 years. And all of them have actually predicted decline for oil demand through 2050. That's a long time from here. What do you think would happen then with regards to demand? Do you think oil demand would fail to fully recover from COVID crisis as well, taking all of the scenarios into consideration? Because policymakers are imposing more aggressive measures to significantly reduce carbon emissions as well.
It's definitely true that COVID raises the possibility that we could have seen peak demand. But I think the key really lies in the aviation sector. So let's look at the numbers. Argus estimates that global oil demand for jet fuel last year was between 7 and 8 million barrels per day. That is roughly 7 or 8% of the global oil consumption, which was close to 100 million barrels per day last year. So assuming that about 70% of those 7 or 8 is not coming back into the market, we're talking about 5 million barrels per day. So we're talking about 95 million barrels per day that are still there, that could be back fully in place in terms of demand, in terms of consumption next year, but not seeing a full recovery of the aviation sector would still leave a hole of 5 million barrels per day. Now, it's still quite ambitious to think of a recovery from every other sector up to 95 million barrels per day. So as long as we don't have the full return of the air fleet, the global air fleet, to full operations, it's unlikely that we will go back to levels of consumption seen back in 2019. The international organizations regulating air travel are now forecasting that air travel levels will probably not go back to 2019 levels until 2024. So I would agree that it's difficult to see oil demand recovering to 2019 levels in the next 5 years. After that, it will really depend on how much progression there has been in terms of the adaptation of the transport fleet, whether that's car and air fleet as well, into renewable sources. It's unlikely that we will see anything material for the airline sector, but at that point in time, we can see that probably electric vehicles will have made a lot of progress in such a way that just when airline demand is normalizing, we could start to see a decline in the demand for gasoline and diesel as transport fuels. Nobody's expecting that transport fuels will take the lead in recovering demand. It will be mostly petrochemicals. So it will also depend on whether the economy is strong enough to start demanding the resources that are needed from the petrochemical sector. The longer it takes for the global economy to return to growth, the less likely it is that we will see another peak in oil demand, and the more likely it is that we will have seen a peak in 2019.
Right. So with all of this, another question that I have with you right now is with regards to how crude reacted on the news that came with regards to US President Donald Trump testing positive for COVID. With that, a US stimulus package eluded negotiators as well amid the ongoing worries about demand. Taking these into consideration, you have US elections as well, which are lined up in the month of November. Do you think there is an expectation of a downward spiral from here on? And if yes, how low could crude go from here on?
So you mean downward spiral in prices, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the key variable, there are two ways in which the US can affect the global oil market. It's the world's largest oil producer, and it's also the world's largest oil consumer. So it's from the supply and the demand side. A Trump win is, in terms of supply, is bearish for oil, right? Because it's more likely that a continuation of the Trump administration will grant the permits for the fracking to continue in areas where it hasn't taken place before, like some areas of New Mexico, that a Biden administration might actually not authorize for fracking.
Right. And overall, if you go to see, we've seen oil fall to a historic negative of almost $40 a barrel in April this year, when global transport ground came to a halt and virtually factories, everything has stopped. Clearly, there has been a rally of almost 200% now from March, from March till now. Taking all of this into consideration, again, what happens with regards to different economies, what happens in the geopolitical front, if you take US, China into consideration, and simultaneously the impact that you see with regards to where the dollar index goes, that's something which has a bearing on crude prices as well. How do you see that equation moving?
So China, of course, is the world's largest oil importer, and it's increasingly taking more crude from the US. There is a big question mark about whether next year, when the independent refiners in China get their new import quotas, they will continue to import as much US crude as they have recently. The surplus is going to be coming from the US. So it's key that Asian economies, if not China, others, are able to absorb that surplus, including India. India is also a major buyer of US crude, and it has shown a readiness to buy even more. So if China is not there, other buyers like India will have to be there to buy it. As we see the price recovering as well, we see a bit of additional production coming from the US. But yes, you're absolutely right that if the buyers in Asia are not there for US crude, which is the one setting the marginal price for the barrel right now, there is potential for prices to again come down closer to the levels that we had seen earlier this year.
Right. And you know what happens is, I was reading where, in terms of where Saudi Arabia, for example, is concerned, will need an average crude price, say, of around $75, $76 a barrel to balance its budget. Now, if you talk about oil producing countries, what is that average crude price that is needed for them to balance their budget? Because otherwise, I mean, that's something which is going to impact them, and that's going to stop consumption as well somewhere.
It varies across the different countries, as you said, but it's safe to assume that any price above $50 per barrel will be high enough for production to continue across most basins, including the higher cost non-conventional areas in the US, Canada, Brazil, etc. So that 50 is important because it's what generates some stability in terms of supply. But in terms of the requirements, the budget requirements of these OPEC countries, I think that most of them have higher requirements. And even our forecast, the Argus forecast up until 2022, is not more than $55 per barrel on average. So it's very unlikely that in the next 5 years, we're going to see a price that fully meets the requirements of the producers in terms of budget requirements. So they will have to significantly reduce expenditure and come up with budgets that adapt to lower oil prices for the long term.
Right. So with this, we have the annual World Oil Outlook meet also that will be held by OPEC in the month of November itself. Anything that you're expecting on that front?
As you say, the US election will be key because that will also determine whether there's an opening for two key suppliers to come back into the market or not, Venezuela and Iran. By the way, India used to be a big buyer of crude from both countries, and India has had to retrench in terms of their purchases from those two countries as a result of the threat of US sanctions. So a Biden administration would be more inclined perhaps to allow for some flows from these two countries to reach some Asian economies. And at that time, when OPEC meets, it's going to be clearer as to whether we can expect some recovery in output from these countries. In fact, for Indian refiners, the best thing that could happen is that the market opens up, because it's the quality of crude that these two countries are producing is key to ensure that the refineries in India operate on a profitable basis, and that refining margins return to better values as we were seeing before COVID.
Right. And then, Alex, what has happened is we have been looking at crude probably at one point in time when we did see that $100 per barrel mark. Do you think that's going to be a long shot dream to see crude back at those levels? Probably even for the next 3 to 5 years, we might not see those numbers.
It had been a long time since they hadn't asked me that question. And I think it is quite relevant at present because it really uh, tells you whether you expect it to happen or not, really tells you that the two stories that could be developing over the next decade, whether we see peak demand or we have seen peak demand or whether peak demand is yet to come. My personal view is that we're probably not going to see $100 per barrel over the next 10 years. We probably will see spikes towards 80 and perhaps $90 per barrel. But at those levels, the productivity and the profitability of shale production in the US is likely to be very high. That is going to bring along a lot more unconventional production from the US. That will also allow OPEC to not be so concerned about restraining production. So as soon as we see those high levels, we'll see more supply, and that will automatically shorten the cycle and flatten the cycle of high and low oil prices for them to stabilize at. Like we saw now, they fell to 15 and they bounced back to 40 very quickly. Likewise, if they go to 80 or 90, I would expect that they will stabilize and come back down very quickly. So I don't think we're going to see $100 per barrel within the next few years.
Right. And, how do you see the market challenges confronting the OPEC? You know, as we are headed in the end of the year and into 2021 now?
So the biggest challenge, of course, is compliance, and especially making rebalancing within the organization, right? Those who have over complied, whether they're willing to still have the free riders who are not fully complying. So it's a challenge of cohesion. And OPEC has proved over and over again that it is relevant to the market. And I would expect that OPEC is going to manage to overcome those challenges. That's not to say that it's going to be easy, but I would expect that there is so much at stake that they will probably, even if the non-compliant parties don't make an effort to comply, the likes of Saudi Arabia and others will still have to over comply to meet those targets. And Saudi Arabia won't let OPEC just become irrelevant by not committing to those targets. So I think the challenges will be aired during the meetings, etc., and also in terms of how US production recovers next year. But I think in the end, OPEC will have to produce less crude, and they will do so. So they will face those challenges.
Right. And Alejandro, do you think US is likely to keep a favorable view of the OPEC? Or do you think probably we could see a change of administration, say, post-December in the month of Jan or Feb?
Excellent question. Certainly, if we continue to see a Trump administration, I would be very surprised if the president turns around and says, "Oh, now we have a different view," because he wants higher oil prices to benefit the domestic industry in the US, the production industry, and to a degree the refiners as well, who also don't want to see prices as low as $15 per barrel or even negative prices. A Biden administration, I think, is unlikely to celebrate OPEC, but they may take a more nuanced approach and not be so critical as past Democratic administrations have been. So I do see a long-term convergence of interests between the US and OPEC going forward. So maybe a change of administration will not let that be so flagrant and so visible, But I think in the end, there is a convergence of interest, and the US will not be so critical of OPEC going forward. They realize that OPEC serves a purpose, and OPEC serves the purpose of balancing the market beyond price interests, because they do balance the market.
Absolutely, and that's something we should be watching out for from here on as well, because a lot of events that will be important to gauge as to in what direction we go from here on. But thank you so much, Alejandro, for joining us on the show, for giving us great insights with regards to how the crude markets are expected to behave from here on. It was great chatting up with you as well. I hope you enjoyed our discussion as well, and we will see you back soon again. Thank you so much. So that was Mr. Alejandro Barbajosa, VP Crude and LPG, Middle East and Asia Pacific, Argus Media, in conversation with us at Nirmal Bank. Thank you so much and stay safe.
Thank you, bye.